There's a different kind of distance between us. We are emotionally close. Even if we're physically distant, we remain emotionally close. But that emotional closeness is not just a metaphor, because what it means is that my emotions affect Julianne more than they affect you. There's a different kind of distance that's involved. It's what we could call emotional distance. But how do we measure emotional distance? It's not clear. We cannot measure emotional distance with rulers and clocks. And yet, it's clearly a reality. We are more or less emotionally close to each other. And if I'm emotionally close to you, I can have effects on your emotions even when you are physically far away from me. Right? But if we're emotionally distant, I won't have much of an effect on you even if you're physically close to me. This is very important for parapsychology, because parapsychological effects are not mediated by measurable distances. And yet there is some kind of distance involved. So in some way, as I stand here at this moment, I am emotionally connected to people all over the planet. We as a group, as Joseph well knows, are connected to the whole planet. And so what we're thinking here and what we're feeling here is radiating out into the environment. But it doesn't radiate out with an inverse square law, for example, so that people in Lafayette feel less than people in Pleasant Hill. It radiates out based on some kind of emotional resonance. This is where some doctrine like morphic resonance might be relevant, because morphic resonance, that's Rupert Sheldrake's term, may be a way of talking about distance in these transphysical worlds. I may have a causal effect in the transphysical worlds on entities to the extent that there's a kind of morphic resonance between us. I'm not sure if that's exactly right, but something like that, right? And what I want to say is that learning to understand transphysical distance is one of the keys, perhaps the key, to a science of the transphysical worlds. How do we do that? But the main point I want to make here is that we have to complexify our analysis of the world and realize that it's not just these little black lines here, but it's also the red lines, right, that come from the transphysical world into the physical, and it's also these orange lines that link transphysical entities to each other. So we now have three major sets of causal interactions that have to be taken into account when we analyze what's happening in the waking world. Does that make sense? See what I'm getting at? And so I really want to emphasize this by saying it once more. Our current science is all about this abstract slice of the causal interactions that are going on. What we need is a science that recognizes these causes, the causes that go from higher grade occasions to lower grade occasions, and these causes which link higher grade occasions to each other. These causal interactions are less abstract than these are. Right? These are just about like very simple experiences like electromagnetic charge or color or something. These are about feeling and thinking. They're more concrete, they're richer. Right? And these are some sort of compromise, right? These allow the understanding and the possibilities discerned by high-grade occasions to influence the behavior of lower-grade occasions in the physical world. Whole different way of looking at things. Right? There's no reason that the rules affecting this kind of causality are not rational. There's no reason that the mind cannot work on these and make some sense out of them. And we'll talk about that more on Sunday. But we haven't directed our attention to this. You know, the people who developed calculus and analytic geometry were genetically identical to the people who were living in the woods 10,000 or 20,000 years ago. There's been no significant genetic variation. In other words, those people were as smart as we are, and yet they didn't have the calculus. They didn't have the mathematical tools that we do. Why not? The reason is because they weren't interested. it hadn't occurred to them that measurement would be important. Right? It wasn't until after the Renaissance that people got the idea that they could understand reality by measuring it. But once people got that idea, they began to pay attention to movement. And as people began to pay attention to movement, they began to discern the mathematical forms which make it intelligible. My suggestion is that once we begin to attend to these other causal relations, we can begin to develop an understanding of their logic. I don't exactly know what that'll look like, right? But this is where we need to direct our attention if we're going to form a more adequate and more scientific understanding of the actual world in which we live, rather than the abstract cross-section of that world with which science now deals. Okay, so this whole analysis, the analysis of these three sets of causes, particularly this set of causes and this set of causes, I call the transphysical dimension of the physical world. We are embodied beings, all of us. And all of the beings that we encounter in the waking world are embodied beings. We're all in bodies that at the bottom are constructed of macromolecules, every one of us, right? And the macromolecules are inorganic, just like the atmosphere is inorganic and the lithosphere and the hydrosphere and so forth. They're all inorganic. And all of us are embodied in the physical body of the earth. That we're embodied beings, right? We interact with each other physically through the inorganic, and that's the physical world. And then also, as higher grade matter, living in conjunction with physical matter, we causally interact with the physical matter of our bodies, and we directly interact with each other through subtle or transphysical space, not through physical space. And so even though we're all in bodies, we're also linked by empathy and linked by telepathy all the time. And that dimension of the waking world is the transphysical dimension of the waking world. Okay? Now that's not where this ends, however, because I want to suggest that there are also entities which are made of transphysical matter that do not have physical bodies of their own. Right? So now now we're talking about the transphysical worlds proper. The transphysical worlds and this is a distinction which people do not clearly make, and it's a very important distinction. We are physically embodied. Even though we are not physical beings, we are physically embodied. And there's a very large class of interactions which we have through our physical bodies. Right? But that's not all she wrote. Right? We also have causal interactions with each other directly that bypass, as it were, the physical body. And those interactions are extremely important determinants of the behavior of people, and also in particular of masses of people. Right? So that when a mass of people gets together to do something, when there's a mob, let's say, or a political rally, those people are generating a tremendous intensity of emotional energy. And it's like a laser, it sort of amplifies the emotional energy. And that emotional energy broadcasts out into the environing transphysical worlds, right? And people all over the planet feel it, depending on their level of resonance with that particular quality of energy. And so large social movements can't be understood without reference to the transphysical dimension of the physical world. Sociology and history are unintelligible without taking this into account. Any attempt to explain things that doesn't take this into account is doomed to failure by means of excessive abstraction. Okay, but that's not all, right? Because there are transphysical worlds. There are worlds other than the physical world, right? And we come to know those worlds through our transphysical senses. We actually have transphysical senses, and we call them the imagination. So we can close our eyes and see other places. Right? If I ask you, what color is your car? There's a reasonable chance you'll see it in your mind's eye. Right? That's a transphysical sense. But there are other ways these transphysical senses operate. So imagine that while I'm speaking, you start to tune out. Don't do it. Just imagine you're doing it. And if you were to tune out, my voice would fade into the background, and you might start thinking about something else, something that's happening in your life, let's say. Right? And if you got into that deeply enough, you would be, as we say, 1,000,000 miles away, somewhere else in your imagination. And then suppose that you got so deeply into it that you crossed the border into sleep. And let's say you suddenly found yourself in a lucid dream. Well, then you would be experiencing another world in another body. You'd be in a transphysical body. You'd be experiencing a transphysical world. And then you might shift your attention back to your physical senses and be back here. Some of you, most of you probably had that experience, especially on a sleepy day. You sort of drift off into a dream and then come back. Right? We're going back and forth between worlds. We have transphysical senses and we have physical senses. And we have the capacity to shift our attention from one set to the other. In the waking world, the transphysical senses tend to be in the background. They're operating all the time, but they're in the background. But we can actually bring them into the foreground and move the physical senses into the background, and then we find ourselves in transphysical worlds. Now, there's a whole story about this that scientists have, in which basically the transphysical worlds are patterns of electrical activity in the brain that rearrange things we saw when we're awake. And we could spend a long time talking about that. I've shown in other things I've written why that idea doesn't work. But I'm just inviting you to take the evidence of your own experience seriously. When you dream, if nothing else, you find yourself in another world, in a body, which is not the physical body, having experiences with other beings who are not subject to your control or volition. We may or may not be lucid in those dreams. We may or may not be, out of the body, right? But still, we see there are other worlds, and we are the only civilization in history that have denied the reality of those worlds.